Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for Bracewell's Environmental Monthly Webinar. A really interesting topic today that I think many of us were expecting with the election of President Biden, but it came to fruition on January 27th, and that is environmental justice. I thought we would focus the discussion today on what happened on the 27th and how we see that playing out both in Washington, D.C. and on the ground at the facility level. Joining me today is Anna Burhop from our Policy Resolution Group. I think you'll appreciate having Anna's perspective. She spent 8 years on the Environment and Public Works Committee inside the Senate, which has jurisdiction over EJ issues, as well as my partner, Whit Swift, in our Austin office. Whit is focused on permitting issues for his clients and frequently advising them when their plants are expanding, and that has implications in the local community where some of these environmental justice issues I think will play out. So with that introduction, let me turn it to Anna just to describe for us, start from before January 27th, what is environmental justice and where did it come from? Because this concept has been around for some time, and I think it's just good to sort of set the table with that.
Sure. So environmental justice, it is a somewhat nebulous term for some people. And it is also, it's a movement that's very peculiar to the United States. It's not a global issue. And it's something that we as a nation are still, trying to grapple with how to best address. But basically what it is it's an effort to ensure the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards for all people and equal access to the decision-making process in order to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. So we see it mostly manifest itself in the federal government's efforts to consider these types of goals throughout federal decision-making. But like you said, it's not a new idea, even though for some of us it's just sort of rising to the surface of our awareness. So it actually, the environmental justice movement was born in the civil rights movement. And specifically, the first time that it was really acknowledged was in 1968 during the Memphis sanitation workers' strike. Even though it started in the middle of the civil rights movement, it took about 22 years, give or take, for the first real federal acknowledgement of what the idea of environmental justice was, when the EPA administrator at the time set up an environmental equity work group. This work group was pretty much put together to address some allegations that had come around that basically racial minority and low-income populations were bearing a higher environmental risk burden than the general public. EPA did what it does best. It investigated, and it found that these allegations were, in fact, true. And then in 1992, the agency stood up the Office of Environmental Equity. 2 years later, this office was changed to the Office of Environmental Justice. And this was part of the 1994 executive order that President Bill Clinton signed, which was EO 12898. And that was the very first big, prominent acknowledgement of environmental justice, was this 1994 executive order. And I know that we'll talk about this in a minute, but this is also the executive order that Biden had promised to update as part of his campaign, and actually did about 2 weeks ago.
And you could really feel, this has kind of come back every 10 years in a different form for the last 3 decades, but with this campaign and where the country was, I think you could really feel that the thread of racial injustice and the environmental movement kind of coming together around the environmental justice idea. And I know it was a priority of President Biden during his campaign, and then obviously shortly after the inauguration, coming out with the executive order. So lay out for us what happened on January 27th in terms of the executive order, and what that set up in terms of processes and people going forward that are going to be focused on these issues?
Sure. So the order that was issued was actually called the Executive Order on Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. It didn't specifically talk in the title about environmental justice. So I think maybe some people might be confused as to why environmental justice was included in this climate executive order. But the two things are linked. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later if we want to. So this climate executive order was basically the way that President Biden is delivering on his campaign promises, which is basically to aggressively tackle climate change. So the order itself is pretty sprawling. It directs federal agencies to procure carbon-free energy and electric vehicles. It's working to spur commercialization of clean energy technologies, accelerate clean energy generation and transmission projects, and then also ensure that disadvantaged communities get a fair share of economic and environmental benefits. So this part towards the end, at the very end of this long executive order, is the part that formalizes President Biden's campaign promise on environmental justice. And this is his government-wide commitment to elevate this concern and address basically the disproportionate pollution burdens faced by many communities of color. And that's why it makes some sense for the environmental justice component to be in this climate change executive order. So basically, the order does a handful of things related to environmental justice and setting up a future plan for really addressing this big, wide national issue. So it sets up, a White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council, a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. It, establishes new or strengthens existing environmental justice offices at EPA, DOJ, Health and Human Services, and a handful of other agencies. And it also requests basically that all of these folks work on ways to further update President Clinton's 1994 executive order. Because what Biden has done here is he's updated a couple of components, but he's looking for more ways to, in the future, to really beef up the environmental justice efforts of the federal government. So, these different agencies, they have to incorporate environmental justice into their mission statements. It also creates a Justice40 Initiative, which basically the goal is to deliver 40% of the overall benefits of relevant federal investments to disadvantaged communities. And they're looking at clean energy, energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable housing, workforce development, addressing pollution, and setting up clean water infrastructure. And then it also sets up basically an environmental justice screening tool. But a lot of that is at EPA.
All right, so I think, Whit, that's your cue. So take us, I know each EPA and the state agencies that implement the environmental laws are kind of your core focus. So what does this mean at EPA in terms of the executive order and environmental justice?
Sure, yeah, well, as Anna said, the order is really a lot about, kind of an all-government approach, and it's going far beyond just EPA in talking about environmental justice goals, but not surprisingly, when you're getting back to an environmental justice issue, EPA certainly has a lot to do under the order. As Anna said, there's this interagency council. EPA is going to have an environmental justice officer that are represented on that council that's going to be looking at how to, improve environmental justice performance across all government, and as well this advisory council that EPA is to establish, and that part is just an advisory role. They're going to establish this advisory council. The president is to appoint people from various walks of life, and they will advise that interagency council about how to, increase federal government's efforts and performance on environmental justice issue. But there are also some specific, really getting toward what's happening or what's likely to happen to the regulated community, some things I think that you'd see, more direct impacts. One of the things that this order talks about is strengthening enforcement of environmental violations that have a disproportionate impact on underserved communities. So there's an emphasis, an enforcement emphasis. And as Anna mentioned, the order from January 27th also tells the Attorney General to develop its own environmental justice enforcement strategy and to cooperate and coordinate with EPA on that. So I think there you see an enforcement emphasis both at the AG's office and at EPA. The other impact that I see is most likely affecting the regulated community is this community notification program that is identified in the executive order, and that's about monitoring and providing real-time data on emissions and other pollutants to fence-line communities. So there are some direct impacts I think that you could see there on the regulated community, in addition to things like the Justice40 Initiative that Anna mentioned about, ensuring that a certain percentage, 40% of this federal sort of climate infrastructure, clean energy infrastructure spending goes toward disadvantaged communities. There's this EJ screen tool that Anna mentioned, which is a tool that EPA has established that's used to identify the disadvantaged communities, those that should get assistance from EJ-focused programs. And so I think EPA is charged with working on expanding and improving that tool such that it could be used government-wide to identify where these communities are that should be the targets for this 40% benefit program. There also, the order also calls for a scorecard, like a web-based scorecard to be established where they can track performance toward that Justice40 initiative. So you see that there's really those two parts, and EPA is involved with both. One is this, sort of enforcement and information sharing part that EPA is charged with, which is assisting those communities by reducing the impacts of pollutants on those disadvantaged communities. Then this other part, which is trying to benefit those communities from this sort of infrastructure investment part of the climate initiative, and trying to target benefits of those programs and investment and money to those communities, and EPA is involved in both sides.
So taking a step back, if I'm the regulated community, what I hear is there's all this, there's a concern and a call for strategy. There's these councils and advisory committees that are being assembled to try to figure out what that strategy is. And then another facet of this is that it seems like while the strategy is being formulated and the tools are being fashioned, they're determining where to deploy those tools, right? They're coming up with screening mechanisms for figuring out how to identify the disadvantaged communities where these tools should be deployed. What then, if you're the regulated community, might you be doing or thinking about as you anticipate, this energy being focused and deployed into those communities? So I guess Anna first, kind of from a Washington perspective, what are people doing? What are they thinking about in how to prepare for the challenges associated with this new energy and this new focus from the administration and from the environmental agency?
Well, I mean, when it comes to DC, they've got a couple of different factors that are always part of the conversation. You've got the federal agencies as part of the administration. And of course, they all are, like you said, trying to figure out what exactly their responsibilities are now and what concrete actions they can take to further the environmental justice goals that Biden just laid out. You also have the legislators on Capitol Hill, and a lot of folks there also very invested in the environmental justice idea, and they've been looking for ways to do their own part here, and a couple of them have already identified areas that have been discussed already. Whit talks about the kind of idea of like mapping as part of the EJ screen. And I know that I think within the last week or so, like Senator Markey and Tammy Duckworth introduced a bill specifically designed to make this mapping of disadvantaged communities and their pollution burdens to make that a reality. So you have those two components that are happening at the same time in DC, and then you have the advocates. You've got the people who come to the Hill or come to the agencies and say, this is something that's important to me, and this is why. So the environmental justice advocates the issue is very emotionally charged for a lot of people. And so the advocates are really riding this tide, especially following the January 27th executive order. There's not really a single platform, like most things, but there are a couple of things that I think are interesting that the EJ community hasn't always been, fully behind, like cap and trade or carbon tax, but, investment in disadvantaged communities and the mapping that we just talked about. Those are things that they're really interested in. A lot of it is investment focused, just to make sure that, everyone is taken care of. So I think that's the first way to answer that part of your question.
Do you see companies fashioning a narrative around their environmental justice position or things that they're doing just so ESG is another sort of, I think, relatively nebulous and evolving concept in the vernacular of corporate America, and EJ seems to me to be, maybe 5 to 7 years behind that. But now, there will be calls and attention focused on what are you doing on EJ? If you want to build this piece of infrastructure, how are you taking into account EJ? So I would anticipate that companies will be making a move towards, having a response to those kinds of questions.
Right, and that's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up because, part of what we do at the Policy Resolution Group is take our clients to the Hill, to the federal agencies, to the administration, and because environmental justice is such a huge focus, and it's very important, but it also touches just about every agency. What we have been advising clients and helping them with is for those who are in a good position to do so. Not everybody is, but identify ways that you have been mindful of environmental justice concerns, or at least have, a little statement that you can say, we support this, we support X, Y, Z. These are our plans for the future, because it will come up, I think, in a lot of conversations that we have. And so, I've worked with some of my clients on getting statements ready, and I know that this is something that, folks are preparing themselves for when DC opens up again to the general public. These are conversations that are important to have.
So, okay, so let's go outside of the Beltway, because sometimes people live inside the Beltway like me and Anna think that's the only perspective, but Whit, you actually have to help your clients get permits to, run their facilities. And I'm curious, sort of the same sort of question, right? If you're on the ground, operating your facility day to day, thinking about permits for the future, how is this going to manifest itself, and what should you be doing to be prepared for it from your perspective?
Yeah, the permitting side of this is really interesting. I think, from that project perspective, this looks like developments that could make permitting get more difficult, especially if you're trying to permit a new greenfield site, or more likely a change or expansion of a site that is located in or near or impacts an environmental justice community. I think particularly in those areas or programs where you're getting a federal permit or authorization, you could see the impact. If you end up with some obligation to look at, as part of the permitting process, how multiple industrial sites or plants affect a disadvantaged community, depending on how they choose to implement this, it could create a roadblock to getting permits, at least for larger types of projects. I mean, a lot, in my view, remains to be seen here as far as what tools EPA and the other agencies will use to employ those, or to address, I guess, EJ concerns when it comes to federal permits. The bulk of my work is done at the state permit level with states that have approved or delegated programs. And there, I think there's even greater uncertainty about how this initiative will impact it. Texas, for example, it takes this position that, when the TCEQ issues a permit, it's protective at the property line from an air emissions perspective, or at the edge of the mixing zone for Clean Water Act permitting. And that's the position that the agency has always taken, that, the way we do things, it's protective at the fence line, regardless of who's there. And you do things like modeling that take into account background concentrations of pollutants and the like. And so that they're protective of the fence line community just as well as they're protective of anyone outside of the property line or the plant site. EPA has a role in that permitting process as a commenter, or they can object to certain permits like an NPDES permit. But, I have not seen these sort of EJ concerns coming from the federal government impacting the permitting process here in the past. And it'll be real interesting, I think, to see whether and how EPA makes this a priority and how it might use its leverage points in the state permitting process when it comes to those authorizations. Again, that's the bulk of what I do. I think, obviously there could be more direct impacts on permits issued by federal government agencies, but it will be real interesting to see, to me, if, and if so, how it could affect permitting in delegated or approved states.
I think, too, just from my perspective, and it's outside the Beltway, but NEPA is obviously a very significant statute for building infrastructure in the United States, and it was in a state of reform during the Trump administration, and some of that is being, changed with the Biden administration. But NEPA has always had, coverage for socioeconomic impact. That was one of the things that was analyzed when you looked at the impact of the proposed federal decision, and that had two sort of factors of socioeconomic evaluation: context and intensity. But context looks at your local, regional, and national circumstances, right, of how that impact would be felt. And then your intensity tries to look at the severity, considering that context. But as these environmental justice policies are formulated by the advisory groups and the committees that have been put together by the executive order. I think we should expect to see that manifest itself inside of NEPA. And you can see some of the, I think the CEQ will be a central point for that sort of coming together and coalescing, and the appointment of Brenda Mallory sort of suggests that that's the direction that CEQ is going to take things. So that's a outside the Beltway view of what's happening inside the Beltway, and will impact infrastructure development, I think, around the United States under NEPA. And I want to go back to something that you flagged at the beginning, maybe as just one final point, because I know we're kind of running out of time on a great topic, but you said there's this difference between environmental justice and climate change, and there's been this linkage, at least in the executive order, to the two ideas. I always conceptualize climate issues, you know, if you have a greenhouse gas emission at your facility, that the global warming impact of that emission is ubiquitous within a matter of days, so it's not sort of specific to the fence line or the mixing zone as Whit was talking about it. So why are these two things associated, and how should we think about environmental justice in relation to climate change from the executive order?
I think the easiest way to think about it is not necessarily about the global issue of climate change or greenhouse gases rather, and more about pollution concerns for the near-end communities, the neighborhood communities. And I think that's largely how this administration is approaching it. It's also, again, this movement started in civil rights back in the 60s, and it still has a very significant civil rights component to it. So, you know, and it's also something that the Vice President has been very passionate about. And I think that a lot of this is likely being driven from her perspective.
Yeah, and you see not only that, at least as we're taping this, you know, the administrator nominee from the Biden administration for EPA is the first ever African American to serve in that position, and you also saw the environmental justice community weigh in against another candidate based upon their environmental justice position. So there's a lot of energy behind this. It's sort of discerning how that's going to manifest itself over the next few years for the regulated community that will, I think, be challenging. But amazingly, we've covered it a half an hour, and we've only skimmed the topic. But I want to thank Whit and Anna for the coverage that they did provide. I also want to thank our colleague Ryan Aletto, who helped us to put together this webinar, but doesn't appear on your screen. We will be mailing out some slides for CLE credit. Thank you again for joining us. I hope these topics are useful to you and your practices. We certainly hope that. And if there are other topics that you hope we will cover in the coming months, feel free to reach out to any of the practitioners that you work with at Bracewell, and they'll share their ideas with the group, and hopefully we can continue to make these useful to you. Thank you, and have a good day.